This introductory chapter is about the individual instruments within the orchestra, and we will explain what each instrument can do and its place within the orchestra. To help with this, we have created a template with some basic instrumentation. We have also created a graphic in which you can see the standard American orchestra layout. Of course, the orchestra is variable, but this is the basic standard seating layout. And so we will start with the violins on the bottom left. In fact, there are two violin sections, the first and the second violins. Usually, the first violin will play the lead melody, and the second violins will play the second voice. However, as far as instrumentation goes, these instruments are, as far as we are concerned, more or less identical. Within this layout, the lead violinist will usually sit in the far left corner, and he will lead the violin section. For our purposes, we will discuss the violin 1 instrument, as there is no difference sonically or practically with violin 2. For this, we are using the VSL Special Edition Volume 1 library. This library contains all the orchestral instruments along with a variety of articulations for each instrument. So now, I will open the VSL library violin so we can hear it. And in the middle of the instrument here, we can see the articulations section, with a variety of articulation types, and these relate to how the instrument is played, for example, with long notes or short notes, etc. For example, by clicking here, we have staccato articulation. This is when the instrument is played with a fast attack and very little sustain, so no matter how long I hold the keyboard, the strings will stop very quickly. And obviously, this is a very important and commonly used way to articulate a violin. If you want this instrument to sound fuller, for example, as if 16 violins were playing, then we wouldn't recommend simply copying this instrument multiple times, as you will have phasing issues, due to the samples being identical. One way around this is to play the violins in separately, so that you are not simply copying the performance. Or better still, check in the presets of your instrument in case there is an instrument that utilizes more violins. Of course, the main thing is to make sure you are using the correct software library for your uses. If you wish to make a massive orchestral sound, then you may need to look for an orchestral library specific for your needs. One thing many people do is to play the music in with one library and then use the same musical lines, not just copied however, but played in again, and use a different library to layer the first library. Another advantage to blending different libraries is that if you are using a library that is fundamentally dry, such as the VSL, you can layer it with a library that has more ambience in it. In our example, we already have a reverb added to our instruments, and we will show this in more detail in a later chapter. But as I just mentioned, by layering, you can certainly make your arrangement sound richer. Of course, which library you use, or which libraries you layer, depends largely on personal choice, and which libraries sound better together, and which ones don't seem to layer quite as well. This is where personal experimentation is important. It is much the same process as layering synthesizers in a pop or electronic production. The only way to find out if something works is to experiment, try different things, and then find the products that work for you. Now, moving on, we have had the staccato violins, but as you can see, there are more options available to us. And so we move on to the next option, which is détaché. This is similar to staccato, but less abrupt. So the note lasts longer, but still stops, and the attack is slightly softer. This is probably not used quite as often as staccato and legato, but is still a very useful articulation. Next, we come to sus, which stands for sustained, and this simply means that as long as we hold the notes on our keyboard, the violin will play. And this can be played polyphonically for chordal work. Next, we come to the P-leg option, and this is the legato option. However, VSL have called it performance legato. Legato in this case is played monophonically, and the performance legato function works by using the modulation wheel. If we play without the modulation wheel, it jumps from note to note. But by using the modulation wheel, we get the slide or portamento effect that is so typical in legato playing. This works extremely well on larger intervals and can certainly bring life to your instrumentation. The next form of articulation available is SFZ, which stands for sforzato. This is an accented form of articulation, so the attack is harder, but the sustain is slightly longer than in détaché. The next possibility we see is TRM, which stands for tremolo. Tremolo is when the string player bows rapidly backwards and forwards, creating a fast repetitive sound. And finally, we come to the pizzicato section. Pizzicato is when the string player plucks the string with his finger rather than bowing it. This type of playing is often used in pop music as well as classical. With all these articulation possibilities, it's clear we can achieve a lot with our library, and some larger libraries might even have more articulation options. In our articulation chapter, however, we will show that it is possible to achieve a lot with less than we have shown here. In fact, using mainly staccato and legato, you can probably perform a large percentage of what you need to do. Being able to control these articulation options will require some practice, however. But by writing key switch events or manipulating your mouse, as we will show later, achieving the desired results will be easily possible. The next instrument is violin 2, but as this is fundamentally the same as violin 1, we don't need to go into detail once again of the options available. One thing to be wary of is that in some libraries, especially the entry-level libraries, violin 1 and violin 2 might share samples, in which case doubling violin 1 with violin 2 will probably sound less rich than expected. Obviously, however, doubling violin 1 with a violin from a different library could help alleviate this issue. Higher-end libraries may also use the round-robin approach. This means a certain number of samples are used to play the same note, one after the other. So, for example, if you play a middle C 3 times, 3 separate samples will be triggered, and this will sound more natural than if the same sample was played 3 times in a row. So we can move on to the viola. If we look at the viola instrument, we can see that it has the same articulation options as the violin. The main difference is that the viola has a larger body than the violin, and hence is lower in pitch. If we listen to the sustained version of the viola, we can clearly hear this. One thing worth noting concerning the VSL library is that even when playing the sustained version of an instrument, we can still articulate it to play shorter, almost staccato if we wish. This is not always the case in other libraries. It's perhaps not quite as strong as the staccato option, but it is certainly useful. You may notice when playing an orchestral library that certain instruments only respond to a restricted range on your keyboard. And if we look below at the virtual musical keyboard, here we can see the range of the viola. This is obviously done on purpose, as this represents the realistic range of the instrument. Unlike a typical sampled instrument, where often the samples are placed over the entire key range, libraries will usually restrict them to the usable range. One major advantage of this might be that if you create an arrangement using a library, and it is then translated to a score and played by real musicians, your instrument ranges will be correct. The next instrument we will look at is the cello, which also has the same articulation options as the violin and viola. Once again, this is a deeper and woodier sound than the violin and viola. We really get to hear the larger wooden body of the instrument, especially in the lower range. It's once again worth pointing out that setting up a template requires a certain amount of effort, but is worth doing in order to be able to control the articulation via the expression controller, or, for example, in this case, to switch between legato and portamento. Now we come to the final string instrument in our string section, and that is the double or contrabass. Once again, it responds identically to the previous string instruments. The contrabass is the lowest of the string instruments. Now we can close the string instruments folder and move on to the brass instruments folder. As you can see, the first instrument is called horns triple, so we have not taken a solo horn, but we have loaded the horn triple instrument, which contains 3 horns. We can see straight away that there are less articulation options available to us. However, there is still a lot we can achieve with these articulations. So let's listen to the staccato version. Much like the string version, the note appears quickly and disappears quickly, even if I keep the notes held on my musical keyboard. Now we have the sustained version. This is a harsher and brighter sound. One thing to be wary of is the issue of breathing. Obviously, when playing this instrument from my keyboard, I can hold the note as long as I want to. Whereas in reality, a horn player has to breathe. But we will cover this in a larger section when we perform a Beethoven piece. By using our expression controller, we can tame the tone of the instrument somewhat. Now we come to sforzato, and once again this has a fast attack with a gentle and quieter release section. We can compare it to the staccato instrument, which in this instance has somewhat more dynamic control available. Now we move on to the legato section, or in the VSL, the performance legato. By moving the modulation wheel, we can control the amount of portamento, and this gives the instrument its livelier character. The fact that we are only controlling the depth of legato rather than the speed of legato is not as critical as one might think, as brass instruments don't have quite the ability of string instruments to control their portamento speed. Even with the speed being fixed, certainly in this library, it sounds wonderful. One thing to point out is that the legato option is monophonic. Now we get to the trumpets. We have also loaded the triple option. And as you can see, the same 4 articulation options are available to us. With the sforzato option played polyphonically, we get this typical trumpet effect. And below, on the virtual keyboard, we can see the range that the trumpets occupy. And again, we can control the velocity crossfade from our modulation wheel assigned to the expression controller. Now we get to the trombones. And yet again we have loaded the triple variation, and yet again they have the same articulation options as the previous wind instruments. One thing we have done in our template and to this instrument is in the sustained version, I have layered it with a staccato sample to give the sound some more attack. If we go to the advanced options by clicking here, we can see the added sample here. Obviously, whether this is right or wrong for a specific piece of music will depend on your personal preferences and the effect required within the music and what style of music you are creating. Now we arrive at the tuba, which is the equivalent of the contrabass in the string section. In our template, we have chosen the solo tuba, and once again, we have the same 4 articulation options available to us. So we'll close the brass section and move on to the woodwinds. And we'll start with the smallest instrument, the piccolo flute. Also here we have various articulation options. We'll start with staccato. In theory, you can switch between the articulations using a key switch. But for the minute, my modulation wheel is assigned to expression and velocity crossfade, so we'll just play through the different articulation versions. Next is sustained. Now, sforzato, which, to be honest, is not that different to the sustained version, but there is a difference. And finally, the performance legato option. Now we move on to the flute. Once again, my modulation wheel is controlling expression and velocity crossfade. One thing we noticed here is that there is a subtle vibrato in the samples, and also that we can play staccato even with the sustained samples. There is a subtle difference between the two options, however. Then we have sforzato, and finally legato. Now we move on to the oboes. Our track is called French oboe. However, if we look in our instruments, we can see that we actually have the Viennese oboe or the oboe Vienna. This is simply an error on our part in the labeling of the track. Not a major issue. Once again, I don't have to change between the different articulations to perform a variety of musical patterns. This is simply the sustained version and the modulation wheel once again controlling expression and velocity crossfade. Even the performance legato patch can easily perform staccato passages. Next we have the clarinets. Once again, we have the same options available to us. These options appear depending on what you select in the matrix. If you wish, you can resize the articulation box to hide items in order to clear up your display. And once again, we can use the sustain patch to play staccato passages, avoiding too much switching. But obviously, having the option is a great thing. It's also interesting to hear how the patch reacts to velocity control. Now we come to the bassoon. If we hear this great staccato version, it instantly reminds us of Peter and the Wolf or certain cartoons. So it's a very useful instrument to have in your library template. And yet again, we have the same articulation options available to us. You may wonder why, for example, when listening to the legato version, it is much less marked than legato, for example, on the violin. This is in fact the nature of the instrument itself. Certain instruments have much stronger legato than others. And with that, we've covered the woodwinds. Next up is the drum and percussion group. First in our group is the glockenspiel. And as you can see, there are no articulation options here. The only performance option is in fact velocity for level control. Next up is the xylophone. This is very similar to the glockenspiel in the sense that there are no articulation options available, but that the level can be controlled via velocity. Once again, this is a very useful instrument, for example in cartoon work, where it is very reminiscent of cartoons such as Tom and Jerry, etc. We haven't loaded all the percussion options, but there are a variety of instruments that you could use, such as vibraphone or marimba. Next, we come to the timpani section. These are tuned kettle drums, and so you can play them from the keyboard to a specific pitch. There are also a few articulation options. These are often played alternating between fourths or fifths. Also, we can articulate rolls. And when playing them, it is important to use the modulation wheel, in our case to control expression and velocity crossfade, to get a realistic and natural roll effect. Also, to end a roll, it's important to end it with a complete note. As you can hear in this example. Obviously, you can also choose which pitch you perform these rolls in. And the final section is called percussion, and this includes all the instruments that may not be used in a typical orchestra, but certainly can be. Instruments such as castanets, chimes, triangle, etc. In fact, by looking here, we can see some of the instruments included. If we look at our graphic once more, we can see that there is a section on the left containing harps, organs and pianos. But these are not always necessary in an orchestra, and we haven't included them in our template. Some libraries won't include these instruments, and some will, but obviously it's a fairly easy thing to add a piano from a different library. In fact, as we are talking about the hybrid orchestra, we could use instruments such as synthesizer pads or Japanese drums, as all of these things could be used in modern orchestral music. But in our case, we have stuck to a fairly small typical orchestra. The interesting thing with the templates such as ours is that you should be able to perform a relatively simple classical piece using your virtual orchestra. And in doing so, you will learn a lot about articulation, about dynamics, which in itself is a challenge, and about the balance between the different instruments within an orchestra. So it might be worth finding a score of a classical piece in order to input it into your computer. In doing so, you will learn a lot about the challenges and the rewards of working with a virtual orchestra. Finally, a small tip when dealing with new libraries. Take the time to go through your library so that you know what instruments and what articulation options you have available to you, so that when you need to perform a specific task, you already have an idea of which of your instruments and patches will suit the required task. So hopefully you have discovered a little bit about the individual instruments that are central to an orchestra and how you can implement them with various articulation options.